Hello and welcome in to the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports. Joined like I am every Sunday during the football season, and you might see behind me it's a bright day. The sun is shining. It's a great day in Kansas. The Jayhawks are going to go bowling for the first time since 2008 after their 37-16 win over Oklahoma State on Saturday. That feels like a scoregami. I can't remember any games that were 37-16 in favor of KU, at least this century. But Kevin, Saturday, what was your experience like, I guess, kind of taking in the game?
Yeah, I think it was one of those things where you went in, and I think a lot of Kansas people were really optimistic because most people felt like you weren't going to face Spencer Sanders, and if you watched, obviously the K State game and the way that thing played out at the quarterback position for Oklahoma State, you felt like there was a chance that Oklahoma State was going to move the ball, but I don't think anybody or a lot of people go in feeling like, okay, this is easy, done and dusted. Like Kansas is no doubt going to win this game, and you and I have seen you covering Iowa State, be covering Kansas and Texas as well. How many times have we seen a team start a quarterback who's had a week to prepare that you haven't really gotten a chance to prepare as much for, and he comes in and really plays well and throws the ball well. Maybe your system isn't quite prepared for what that guy is going to be able to do, and he winds up having a big game. And so I think on one hand you felt like, well, you'd rather face that than face Spencer Sanders. But at the same time, as that game played out, as Kansas started to add some breathing room, Kansas didn't really leave this one in doubt, right? Like, I mean, that was my main takeaway was Kansas kind of did what it was supposed to do, and got the early lead, got the big halftime lead, never really let the game be in doubt in the second half. What did you think from up in the press box?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think KU controlled it. I think going in, I wrote about this on the VIP kind of pregame piece that I do. KU's running game was going to be able to get going against Oklahoma State. And if anything, over the first kind of 3 weeks of the season showed us is that if KU's running game gets going, it just opens up everything else for the offense. And that's why the offense was able to have so much success early in the season. And I think you look at the drive chart. We did a lot of that early in the season, right? Looking at kind of how many drives they had, how many touchdowns. Well, KU punted twice, I believe, on Saturday. And there were some field goal drives as well, but KU got points a lot. And KU controlled the clock a lot. And so as a result, I don't think this is one of those where you look at the score and say, oh, wow, what an offensive juggernaut from Kansas. But in the end, like if you actually watch the game, it was that. KU's offense never looked like it really had to strain. Some moments in the red zone left stuff to be desired, but I think just collectively you look at the offensive performance, and it was a lot closer what you saw in the first few weeks of the season than I think you've seen from Kansas really kind of since that Iowa State game, right? I think you look at the second half against TCU, it was really, really good then, but the first half wasn't great. And then there's just been inconsistencies with Jason Bean at the quarterback position. And Kevin, we talked about it on the podcast here. I'm of the belief you can win games with Jason Bean, but you need to play around him really well. And that's exactly what Kansas did. So I think for me, you look at this, and we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago maybe, has Kansas played a complete game yet? No. I think they just did that on Saturday. I think you look at all three phases of the game. Punting is kind of the one where I'm like, okay, like not great, maybe a 6 out of 10, 5 out of 10. But outside of that, you're looking at 8 or 9 out of 10s across the board, right? I think offensively, fantastic. I think defensively, you force, 4 turnovers? Like that's an A game. You take the ball away from the team 4 times, you're going to win a lot of football games doing that. And then you look at Jacob Porchilla, a really solid game. I'd say probably one of the better ones of his career, right? Consistency making field goals, consistency making the extra points. So I think for me, you look at this team in this performance, I think the bye week did them a lot of help. And I think as a result, it kind of propelled them to have what I consider to be probably their most complete game of the season.
Yeah, I think, the bye week is a good takeaway because I think I made the point on Twitter during the game, even guys who weren't on the injury list, like Devin Neal, certain linebackers, guys like that, they were moving differently this week than when we last saw them in action. There was more pep there, more pop, and this was a team that we talked about last time we did this, which I guess was 2 weeks ago. We talked about how the bye week could not have come at a better time. They were banged up. I mean, they really needed to heal up, and I think the opportunity to do that was huge. I'm glad you brought up the defense, and not just the turnovers were huge, obviously. The other thing was, up until the game was already decided, they limited explosive plays incredibly well. And one of the things that we've talked about on this show all year, people are probably tired of us talking about it is playing complementary football. And for this defense, what it means is don't allow 5-play, 75-yard drives. Make it 15-play drives. And then you're adding extra plays for somebody to miss a block, for somebody to throw the ball where they shouldn't, for somebody to make a mistake, for you to make a good play, to put them behind the chains and potentially get off the field. I thought that was one of the better defensive performances of the year in terms of playing out to what they wanted to play. They've been more shut down at times, against Iowa State, which has kind of struggled offensively. But generally speaking, I think when you look at the defense as a whole and sort of what your goal is, where you really want them to stretch things out and do things slowly and not, bite off 10-yard chunks over and over again. I thought the defense was excellent.
Yeah, I did too. And I think that's a really good point about the number of plays in each drive. Here's kind of a rundown. Also, I mean, 4 possessions in the second half period. That was like classic what you want to see from a team that is a bowl team. You control the clock and you limit the possessions in the second half. KU had like a 7-minute drive in the second half to start it, right? A 7-minute, 52-second drive to start the second half. That was one of those when once that happened, you're like, oh yeah, this is totally over. There's zero chance Oklahoma State can come back because KU just always looked in control. But you look at the defense, right? Here's some of the drives. 7 plays, interception. 4 plays, interception. 8 plays, punt. 15 plays, touchdown. 3 and out. 7 plays, fumble. Half. 11 plays, field goal. 10 plays, touchdown. 6 plays, interception.
And 11 plays field goal, that's a win for the defense.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
Totally. And people say, oh my gosh, they put up points or whatever. But when you force them to take 10 or so plays and all of that, and all they're getting at the other end of it is a field goal, obviously not as good as a stop, not as good as a turnover, but at the same time, that's still a victory for the defense. And so that's a lot of victories, Michael.
Mm-hmm. It is. And I think you look each level of defense, right? I think each kind of unit played really well. Yep. I thought that the defensive line looked the best it has since maybe that Iowa State game. That unit kicked tail all day. And I think there were a few times where you'd watch a run play from Oklahoma State and there'd just be a swarm of kind of blue jerseys. But then you kind of look at the numbers and it's like 53, 92, 98, 93, like a bunch of defensive tackles, right? Yep. Were the guys that were there. And then like a Lonnie
Caleb Taylor and Tommy Dunn looked terrific at times yesterday. They really did. And Jim Panagos deserves so much credit because from where they were at the start of the year, where they were potential, right? Like we were talking on the show and we were saying, hey, late in the year, make sure you watch for Tommy Dunn and Caleb Taylor and all these guys. And it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to be here, bowl eligibility on the line, and have them play that way, have them rack up negative plays for the offense. I mean, what you were talking about the defensive line, and I'm sorry I cut you off. That was something that jumped out to me was I thought that group was excellent yesterday.
Yeah, and if you look at the talent gap, right, we've talked about that, right? Bigger, faster, stronger offensive lines. Baylor and Oklahoma gave KU a lot of fits. Oklahoma State's offensive line has struggled this year. There's no two ways about it. They've not been able to run the ball really well, but you've seen teams come into Lawrence that are struggling in certain areas and come out and still kick KU's butt. And to actually do it, I think, is the impressive part. And then you look at like the linebackers. Right. Rich Miller, I thought, had an incredible game, right? Sideline to sideline. He had the interception. He had a sack at the first sack of his KU career. Lorenzo McCaskill Probably the best game he's played as a Jayhawk. I think you're
Yep.
looking at some of these guys as the season has come along. They're playing their best football right now. And obviously it's one game, one sample size. We'll see how it carries over to Texas Tech. But someone like Lorenzo McCaskill, I thought was pretty good against Oklahoma. Didn't really notice him as much against Baylor, but I think just overall trending, he's trending in the right direction. And then you look at someone like Craig Young in a game like this where they are running the ball a lot. I thought he looked pretty good. And then obviously the defensive backs as a whole. I mean, man, it's hard not to like what you have in someone like Kobe Bryant. I think down to down, maybe some of the coverage consistency might be better, but for someone like him to have the injury he had, Nathan Swaffer is going to write about this on the website today, but I was talking to Kobe after the game, and I thought it was so fascinating. He thought his season was over when his ankle got rolled up on at Oklahoma. You know, when he's getting carted off the field and he has the air cast on, he said he wondered to himself, like, is this the end? Am I done for the year? And soon after, trainer said, hey, you'll be okay. You'll be able to come back at some point. And Kobe lived in the training room. And sure enough, his first play back, interception.
Yeah.
Those are cool moments, right? That's the stuff that why you love college football, because of moments like that, right? And then you look at someone like Mello Dotson. I don't think he's had a great year, but to have that interception and to show some competitive fire there, I think throughout the course of the game was great. Kenny Logan was really good.
Yep.
You notice Marvin Grant laying the wood a couple times. I just think overall this defense, the bye week, you could just see it. The speed, the physicality, I think was back that maybe was missing against Oklahoma and Baylor. And so I think for me, when I project now the final kind of 3 games of the regular season, and then, you know, the bowl game is very much its own thing, but the final 3 games of the regular season, I feel a little bit better about where the defense is at compared to maybe where I was for that Baylor and Oklahoma game. Now, the backup quarterback, right? You have to kind of factor that in here too. But I remember Shane Illingworth coming in as a young guy, as an underclassman in 2020, right? You're like, oh, backup quarterback. Okay, maybe KU can be competitive. No, he carved up KU. So I think it shows the improvement that a highly thought of recruit who is an underclassman can come in, and KU was able to shut him down and make him look like a freshman, right? I think that shows improvement compared to where KU was in 2020.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's funny because I thought, I'm not saying the 2 biggest factors were the 2 backup quarterbacks, but I do think, like you mentioned earlier, Kansas having Jason Bean as a backup quarterback was a big upgrade over what Kansas faced on Saturday. And I want to read something off to you real quick, okay?
Okay, do it.
2-10 the season before. You return a quarterback who's going to be an honors candidate who makes you feel pretty optimistic. You had a whole bunch of transfers. You get off to a really strong start. You get to 5 wins really quickly, game away from bowl eligibility. You play the eventual Big 12 champions, where your star quarterback suffers a shoulder injury. You lose a few games, and then you go on to clinch bowl eligibility. This year's team, also the 2003 Kansas Jayhawks. The difference between this team and that team, which was Mark Mangino's second year, so second year of coaches as well, is that team needed Bill Whittemore to win a football game. And they didn't clinch bowl eligibility until the final game of the season when Whittemore returned from his shoulder injury. Jason Bean was good enough for Kansas to win a football game. And, you know, depending on where Jalen is, you know, from here on out, obviously he's practicing, you know, that's a possibility. Jason Bean can help you win another football game here if need be. And I think that was one of the primary differences between the 03 team and the 2022 team is, you know, that team needed Bill Whittemore. Otherwise, they were not going to beat a whole lot of people. And I think that Jason Bean, when you look at what he did, I'm not saying he had a perfect game. We've talked about the fact that even when Jason Bean has played well, there have been maybe some plays that he's left on the field. You know, he hasn't been flawless, but at the same time, you look at the response when Oklahoma State pulls, you know, relatively close, and then Jason Bean breaks off, you know, that 70-plus yard play. I mean, what did you think when he had that run in terms of, you know, sort of impact on the game as well as what Kansas was getting from Jason Bean?
Well, I thought back to what we've talked about, Kevin, the winning plays,
Yep.
right? Early in the season, there were moments where the game is in the balance and KU is able to take hold of it. I don't know if KU is able to do that 2 weeks ago before the bye week or even last year, right? The moment where Oklahoma State goes and scores their first touchdown, then you go and respond with that long touchdown run from Jason Bean, and then
Yep.
you force a 3-and-out. That right there for me was when I felt like, okay, this is kind of the team that you saw early in the season with those winning plays in the winning moments. And I think Jason Bean deserves a ton of credit.
Yeah.
I think we talked about it. He did not look like someone that was thinking, I'm going to go run the ball right here when he came in against TCU, against Oklahoma, against Baylor. That was not who he was. And then I thought you saw yesterday when he saw the opportunity, he took it. And I think you saw some of that straight line speed that we've talked about. And Lance Leipold kind of said it post game where the coaches have been waiting for that moment. Even the coaches have thought this too. When is this going to happen? When is this guy going to show that elite top 5 track speed in the entire state of Texas? When is he going to show that? And that was the moment. And it turned out to be a huge play. I think for me too, the emotion that he showed after that. Jason Bean, if we're going to do it on a spectrum and compare him to past quarterbacks, right? Jason Bean is closer in terms of demeanor to like Peyton Bender.
Yeah.
Even keel, not going to say a whole lot. And I think Jalen's probably closer to Carter Stanley if we're doing kind of quarterbacks in recent memory. To have that moment where you show that sort of emotion, that's going to fire up your team too, because they know how stoic Jason is and how much he is a down to down, just all right, next play, do my job, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to make a fuss about it. For him to do that, I think had a big impact on the rest of the team as well. So I think for me, that play, if I'm going to highlight one of them in terms of like, hey, this is where I kind of think the game really was when KU grabbed it by the scruff of the neck. I really felt like that was the one because that just hasn't been there. And I think you look at the passing for Jason Bean outside that one YOLO throw he had that was an ode to Brock Purdy, like really good, right? 18 of 23, 203 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. That is a stat line that KU coaches want to see from Jason Bean every single week.
Yep.
The stat line against TCU is great and all, but in terms of sustainable success as an offense, that is what they want to see. Because what does that show you? It shows that KU ran the ball and got Jason Bean in a position where he could pick his spots. And he's not perfect, right? There's still some throws to the flat routes that you're kind of scratching your head like, oh man, that wasn't pretty. But I think just in general, that was a good performance from Jason Bean. He deserves a ton of credit for sticking with it, not getting down on himself after 2 games where the offense kind of disappeared. And I think you see how important it is to have quarterback depth. And I think it showed for Oklahoma State the lack of quarterback depth. And I think QB depth is what won the game for Kansas on Saturday.
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about Jason Bean leaving plays on the field sometimes, a lot of times they were in fairly big moments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like where Kansas needed to have this drive. It's 3rd and 8, and you need this guy to make a throw, and it didn't happen. Those were plays he made on Saturday, and he deserves so much credit for that. And he had help. Kansas's wide receivers made some incredibly clutch catches. How about that LJ Arnold, kind of reaching back behind him on that 3rd down, between 2 Oklahoma State guys. Luke Grimm, welcome back. I mean, he had, some big plays from that standpoint. But I mean, it was one of those things where when Kansas needed him to make a throw, the throw was generally there, and I think that he deserves so much credit for that. You made some good points on Jason Bean as a runner, because I think there's almost kind of a fundamental misconception about Jason Bean as a runner, because he is very, very fast, obviously, very straight line fast. He's not necessarily going to, break somebody down, or whatever. But if he can cut, he can cut back across the grain and make a guy miss that way. And all of that is to say, when you watch him run the option, there's a major difference between him and Jalen Daniels. Jalen Daniels is more of a threat running the option than Jason Bean is, despite the fact that Jason Bean is a faster player, because it's a different kind of speed, athleticism, decision-making, whatever else. And Jalen Daniels, he's a powerful guy too, and so he can make a guy miss. And I think one of the things that we've seen, since Jason Bean took over, Kansas's option game has not been as effective as it was under Jalen Daniels. And that was a big part of the success that Kansas was having early, was that option game. And so I also think, kudos to the Kansas coaches for giving Bean, sort of those carries where he can have the QB draw or QB power or whatever else, where he's not making that decision. It's a different kind of play where he knows he's running the ball and he can just get downhill. And I thought they called that pretty well. Offensive line played really well yesterday, with the exception of, the goal line stand where, they were kind of getting blown off the ball a little bit.
Yeah.
Obviously that was frustrating. You get it down to, maybe the half-yard line or the one, and have 3 downs from there to punch it in, and you wind up, getting stuffed, then losing yards and having to kick a field goal. Obviously that's not ideal, but overall they played a great game. And then we've waited this entire time to talk about it. Devin Neal.
Yes.
Michael, Devin Neal thoughts.
I've been able to see some good running backs
Yep.
in the last 5 or 6 years, right? Khalil Herbert's playing in the NFL. Puka Williams was one of the most dynamic running backs I've ever seen. I spent 2 seasons covering Breece Hall, who is a first round, or should have been a first round pick, but I was having a great season with the Jets before he got hurt. What Devin Neal did yesterday was the best individual performance I've seen. Better than anything any of those guys have done. I think that says a lot about what he just did. And I think there are a few things that are impressive about it. Obviously for historical context, he's the first Jayhawk ever to have over 100 rushing yards and 100 receiving yards in a game. And then you could tack on the fact that, he actually had 224 rushing yards and 110 receiving yards. For a good portion of the game, he had more total yards than Oklahoma State. Just incredible. And I think for me, you look at his workload, and we talked about it in spurts, but I don't think maybe we talked about it enough, where he was getting 15 carries a game. That was it. They were not maxing out his touches. And I think that the Baylor game, the offensive line wasn't great. But also, I don't think Devin Neal looked like he was 100% either. And then all of a sudden you come off the bye week and you see the explosiveness. And I wondered to myself when I was watching some of the kind of the first games of the season, and then you watch some of the pre-bye week stuff, like you're thinking, man, it still doesn't look like Devin looks like he did last year. Just at times where last year he would just break free on these runs and you're like, wow, like that is an incredible play. And it just didn't feel like outside of the Tennessee Tech game that there were many of those plays. And then sure enough, I mean, how many explosive runs did he have? I don't have time to go back and look through it, but I mean, just explosive play after explosive play after explosive play. And then he also carried the ball 32 times and caught the ball 6 times, almost 40 touches. That is incredible. He's going to have a good old ice bath, I'm sure, last night. And I'm sure the team workout today, they kind of managed his load, because that's a career high workload. And that's more workload he had yesterday than I think he had probably over the final 2 games before the bye week. And if you want to account for kind of total touches, maybe even the final 3 games before the bye week.
Yeah, I think the last running back at Kansas to get that many rushes in a game, not even counting the load in the passing game, I believe is Khalil Herbert against West Virginia when he had like that 291-yard game. Herbert had, I think, 35, 36 carries in that game. He also didn't catch the ball, as many times as Neal did, or have the impact that Neal had in the passing game. And, we talk a lot about stuff on the field here, obviously, but, covering Devin Neal as a recruit, you talk to him, pretty much every week for KU football. This is a kid from Lawrence who desperately wanted to come to Kansas and be a foundational point for Kansas turning things around. And he was a guy that committed to Les Miles, and wanted to come and said, I see something in Lawrence I don't understand, or I see something in Kansas I don't understand why Kansas can't be good. And to sort of see the vision and all of that there, where he saw it before it was there, and he had this goal that he was going to help Kansas, become significantly better, because Devin Neal could have gone elsewhere. I mean, he was a big back with a lot of athleticism. I think in high school he was 218 pounds. He's lost some weight, at Kansas, and trimmed down a little bit, but I think he was also like a 4.48 guy as well. I mean, he just a really good running back prospect. And when you look at what Kansas has been able to do,
Mm.
if you would have shown that to 17-year-old Devin Neal, I think he would have been more likely to be able to predict that, or say, because you talked to him in high school and he was like, well, I don't see why not. And
Mm.
so how special do you think that this is for him to be here his second year? Kansas is going to a bowl game, and not to, we usually break these down game by game, but Michael, Kansas could return 10 of its 11 offensive starters next year. So this could just be the start of something.
It could. And college football is about stories, right?
Mm.
You only get 12 Saturdays. It's not like the NFL, right, where they play an exorbitant amount of games and it's taking several months. Like college football is 3 months, and it's about stories and local kids making an impact at their hometown school is one of the best parts about college football. It does not happen in the NFL, right? It's very rare that a player like Kenny Pickett, for example, goes to play at Pitt and then goes to the Steelers. That doesn't happen. And so for a guy like Devin Neal to have that performance in that moment on that game with those stakes, right? Getting the team that he grew up rooting for to bowl eligibility, right? I don't even know if Devin Neal would really even remember 2008 in the bowl, right? I haven't talked about it specifically, but you're talking about someone that was young at that point. And
Yep.
to do it and have him be the one is special. And I think it's one of the cool parts about college football. We've talked about that before, about college game day and the different parts about this season that have been so cool. And I think that having Devin Neal be the one that did that, I think speaks volumes about him. But also, I think it's just such a cool moment. And I hope it gets the recognition nationally that it deserves, because it does. Because, like you said, Neal was an incredibly highly thought of recruit, right?
Yep.
But didn't get a ton of offers. I think a part of that is because a lot of people had an idea that, hey, this guy's going to go
He's
to
locked in.
Lawrence and he's going to go play for Kansas.
Yep.
And I think that impacts the offer list. And I don't think that should take away from how good he was as a high school recruit. And so I think overall, it's just such a cool moment and a cool thing that he's the one that kind of sparked this and propelled this. And if it wasn't Devin Neal there, I'm not sure if KU has this type of offensive performance, and maybe the, playing in all three phases doesn't happen. So I think for me, it's just so cool and so special that it was Devin Neal, the guy that kind of was the catalyst here.
And recruiting wise, coaches sell that to players, right? The hometown hero thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, if you come here as a state of Kansas guy, you're going to be huge. And I think, K-State probably used that with Avery Johnson. I know Kansas used that when it was recruiting Amani Bledsoe, who was, one of the top couple guys in the state. Kansas is after some guys like BJ Kennedy and Jaden Woods in 2025, and guys who are the top guys in their class, like Devin Neal was in his class. It's not a bad tool to have in your tool belt to be able to go back to those guys and say, Devin was the number one guy in his Kansas class. He just did this amazing thing, led Kansas to a bowl game. Look at the way that he's treated, revered, all of these different things. That could be you too.
Yeah, and it's cool. And so, yeah, I think overall the Neal angle is awesome. I guess taking a step back now,
Sure.
Kansas is bowl eligible.
Yeah.
When you think about this, I guess, what do you think is the biggest part of it? I've got a few thoughts, but when you think Kansas bowl eligibility and the impact it has on the program, what do you feel like is the biggest kind of aspect of that?
Well, I think there are two things, and I don't want to steal your thunder on either one of these, but
All good.
The most obvious one is you have that to be able to tell people, and I know that sounds like a small thing or whatever, but it's no longer since 2008.
No,
It's no longer nobody has won here since 2008.
Mm-mm.
You have a recent point of interest that you can say to people, hey, Kansas can win here. We know because it happened last year, or it happened recently. And even beyond that, we talked before the season started and we said we don't know how many wins Kansas is going to have this year. The main thing that we wanted to see was we wanted to see them be more competitive,
Yep.
and we wanted to see them have a point of improvement that they could then build on and take on the recruiting trail, where they basically said, hey, maybe they win 4 games or what it is, but 4 is more than 2. And you could go to people and say, hey, look at this. We're taking a step forward. You wanted to be able to say you're taking that step forward. This is such an obvious step forward to go bowling and all that. And the other thing that's just as big, and I'm sure you're going to mention this, so I'll touch on it just real quickly and then shoot it over to you. Those extra practices
Mm-hmm.
and extra practices for a team that still has a number of young players, one, but two, a lot of guys who are coming back next year. What are your thoughts on this?
I think you hit the part for me is the most important, which is the
Yeah.
practices. I'm going to pull up for a YouTube audience here a quote from Lance Leipold from earlier this week that I used. I asked him about how big it would be if Kansas made a bowl game, and I thought it was just fascinating. And I'll read a snippet here for the podcast audience, but he talks about it basically saying it's big and super important, and quote, it's the extra practices and development. It's not the banging around. It's the time to work, the confidence, experience, going against the speed, all those things that you want. And many times the teams that are the ones in the games consistently have a tendency to keep that gap wider and wider on programs that don't. That, for me, is the biggest part.
Yep.
Iowa State is not making a bowl game. West Virginia is not making a bowl game. Texas Tech might. We'll see. The teams that KU is going to have to compete against in years to come in terms of maintaining bowl eligibility year in and year out, those teams are not going to have those practices. And it's so imperative that Kansas, with the returning production it's going to have, that they are able to do that. And Lance has talked a lot about building quality depth. It's something that he's talked about since the start of preseason. They've worked really hard to do that. And how do you build quality depth? Getting extra practices. Because I think we talked about this maybe after Baylor, that those practices aren't even more so getting Rich Miller snaps. It's getting those younger linebackers snaps or getting those younger defensive linemen snaps, right? It's about getting Tommy Dunn more time with the first defense. It's things like that that help you build that quality depth. It's getting Mason Ellis snaps at safety, Brian Diller snaps at cornerback. Those are the
Ethan
moments.
Vasco snaps at quarterback.
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
yeah,
Vasco as well, right? So that, we'll see what happens with Jason Bean after the season. And he has a decision to make. He can come back for a super senior season. He could go grad transfer somewhere. He has a decision to make, right? Jason Bean is a good quarterback, and I'm sure college football programs would like to have him. Does he want to come back and do this again next year? I don't know. I'm not going to speak for him, but that would be crucial time to get Ethan Vasco more time in the offense. And so for me, when I think about it, that is probably the biggest thing, is just the extra practices to build the depth, to continue to build the culture. I think that's a huge part of this, is continuing to build the culture, get that winning taste in your mouth, right? This team has been really good at putting wins behind them and even putting losses behind them. But to have this experience of getting those extra practices, the extra time together, Lance kind of joked that these players don't understand it. They're going to get another month of just being together, period, as a team. And it's clear that this team likes being around each other. You can sense when a football team doesn't really care for each other. This is legit. You can see it. You can see the reaction on the sideline after Rich Miller gets the interception. These guys care about each other. And I think getting that extra time to help continue to build that culture and that bond within each player, that's going to help further develop this kind of player-led leadership program that Lance Leipold wants. And then, of course, you can get into the recruiting side of things, right? Saying, hey, we went to a bowl game in our second season. Think about what happens when we get you in here. I can go on a whole recruiting pitch right now that I'm sure the coaches are giving. That's huge. Yeah. I think just in terms of brand awareness, right? Being out there, having kind of that Jayhawk logo on one of these bowl games that is on some network in December, right? With the way sports gambling is going these days, people are going to bet on that game. And it's just going to get more people interested in the program, more people having eyes on the program. And so I just think overall, there's not a bad part about having the bowl game. Maybe if I'm being negative, maybe you have a little bit less time to go portaling and do portal stuff. But I mean, shoot, the staff has shown that they can go do portal stuff mid-season, right? You look at
Yep.
Kobe Baines; they're in the middle of camp and they go get him on. They go get him from Louisville. You look at Logan Brown from Wisconsin; they're in the middle of the bye week and they're like, "Hey, come on a visit." He comes on a visit, commits. Like the staff can still manage that. So I just think overall there's no negative sides of having Kansas get to a bowl game, and to have it be in the second season, I think is just it's so crucial for the program to maintain this. And I wrote about it a little bit post game. They took down the goalposts, and I think that signified more than just Saturday's game, but kind of putting the end to what has been the worst decade in potentially college football history.
Yeah.
That's
And certainly
it.
KU football history. I mean, and here's the thing that a lot of people tend to forget. When Mark Mangino fired, resigned, whatever you want to call it, I don't remember the exact terminology now, but when all of that happened and Kansas turned the page to turn Gill, Kansas was an above 500 football program for its history. Now, granted, like Kansas was strong in its early years, and so that's part of it. But at the same time, over the course of what, 80, 90 years, longer than that, actually, 100 plus years probably at that point, you're an above 500 program. And then you think about the last decade, just how far below 500 Kansas has been, no bowl games, no seasons where you win more than 3 games. I mean, and so you add all of that and just kind of throwing that out the window. And I think, one of the things that's going to be kind of fun about this, just sort of off topic, college football coaches sometimes talk about there being 3 seasons, right? You have the season opener, which you have like months and months and months and months and months to prepare for. You have the next 11 games that are basically a week-to-week thing. And then you have a bowl game where, again, you have extended time to prepare and all of this. Is it important for Kansas to win a bowl game? You'd obviously like to win your bowl game. The bigger thing is, I would almost guarantee we're going to see Andy Kotelnicki come up with some really fun stuff. And that's going to be amazing because that's why people watch bowl games, right? And so it's December 27th or 28th. You're done with family Christmas. You flip on the game, and here's Kansas running like a reverse pass back to the quarterback or something like that, and people and recruits see that, right? And they say, "Oh my gosh!" Like, not only is Kansas in a bowl game, they're kind of fun. And so it's a chance to put your program on a stage that it isn't normally on, because every Saturday that you play, there's so many other games. And so most of the people who watch your game are going to be fans of either team, with the possible exception of if it's like a national game. But even in like the thick of bowl season, you're not competing with that many other programs for your television spot. And so there are a lot of eyes for people who just say, hey, what bowl game is on right now? Flip it on, and Kansas is on TV. And the value of that, I don't think that you can oversell that, to have your program have that sort of launching pad to kind of show people what you're about.
Yep, I totally agree. And I have one more question, and then we'll get out of here.
All right.
Now there's a decision to make.
Yep.
For Lance Leipold, Jalen Daniels or Jason Bean next week, right? We don't know. I reported kind of midweek that, hey, Jason Bean will start this week. We'll see if we can get word like that again this week. But if indeed Jalen Daniels is available to play on Saturday, who are you starting?
I think if Jalen is at the point that he can play and you don't have any worries or whatever else, I still think you start Jalen. And I think for a couple reasons, one of which is I think he's your starting quarterback, and I think that Kansas is better when Jalen Daniels is in. That's really easy. But I think the other thing, Michael, is with the situation and the way that position has gone, the other team is forced to spend a lot of preparation time for Jason Bean. And so by playing Jalen Daniels, even if people think on Wednesday, hey, it's likely that Jalen might play, they heard that from different sources this week. I'm not saying they were all correct or whatever else, but I'm saying it was out there. And so I think that they prepare for both, but I think that you get sort of more pop in terms of them not really being prepared for what a certain guy can bring when it's Jalen Daniels. And I think too, you talk about teams that have a lot of speed, right? And you get on the field against them and they say, we were not ready for their speed. Their speed surprises. There was no way for us to prepare for what we were facing. I think you have some of that with Jalen, and not necessarily for the speed aspect, but in terms of people don't realize that, hey, I'm a cornerback. If I let up on my route, or if I let up on the guy that I'm defending 40 yards downfield, Jalen Daniels can still hit that guy. He has that arm strength. He has the arm strength to take advantage of, minor coverage breaks and things like that. On option plays, he's more difficult to tackle than maybe what you think or you prepared for. And so I do think that, he's somebody that you get a little bit more pop from if you play him as opposed to Jason Bean in one of those situations where maybe a team is preparing to face both of them. What do you think?
I disagree. I think you have to start Jason Bean, and not necessarily because Jason Bean is a better quarterback. It's for the culture. Jason Bean has done nothing to deserve losing a starting spot, and you can't hand a starting spot to someone else just because they're back healthy. That's where I come from on this. Lance Leipold's talked a lot about earning it and being there day in and day out and earning it. And Jason Bean earned another start on Saturday. Sure, the offense helped, but the offense helped Jalen Daniels early in the season too, right? We've talked about that. The run game with Daniel Highshaw and how good he was. I think for me, you look at this game on Saturday, Jason Bean has to start. Just my opinion. I think it's a bad look in terms of just the broader culture of the program. How are you going to tell someone, you got to fight for your spot and go grind and compete, but Jalen's going to come back and he's going to start, even though Jason did nothing last week to deserve losing his starting spot. That's the way that I approach this. And if things go haywire in Lubbock next weekend, cool. Bring in Jalen Daniels. What did Jason Bean show you against TCU? You can come in and drop basically 30 points in a half, right? You can do this in this offense. And I don't think Texas Tech's defense is anything to write home about either. So when I look at this game, I don't think there's really even a choice. If you're going to preach culture and competition, the player that won you your sixth game of the season and played a really solid game and barely made any mistakes, I don't know if you can tell him, no, we're going to go back to the other guy who hasn't played in a month. So I guess that's kind of where I come from on this. And it's maybe less so about, hey, who's a better quarterback? It's more so about, hey, you're still building this and you have to make the right decisions culture-wise to set the tone for weeks, months, seasons to come.
Yeah, I think I see it a little bit differently in that, there's the old saying, you shouldn't lose your spot due to injury either. And last time we saw Jalen Daniels, I mean, he struggled in the first half against TCU, but generally speaking, Jalen Daniels was nails before he got hurt. And so if you're looking at where Jalen was before he got hurt, where Jason Bean is now, I don't have a problem with them opening it up and saying, hey, Jalen, you're healthy. Jason Bean is, has been our guy. Let's compete for this week and see who the starter is. I don't have a problem with that. I think,
sure.
I think one of the issues with saying, okay, Jason Bean was really good this past week, he should get the start the next week, is it also ignores Jason Bean against Baylor and Jason Bean against Oklahoma, where it wasn't that he was bad. We've said this before. It's not that he was bad. It was just he didn't quite give you enough of what you needed to win those football games. And so I do think it's an interesting discussion. And I do think, to your point about culture, maybe a competition is the best way to go that week. And you can, and that way, when you sit the guys down, both of them from both sides, you can look at Jalen and you can say, Jalen, you know, we hoped you were ready for this. Jason was better in practice this week. We're gonna roll with Jason right now. Or you can say it the other way, like, Jason, you've given us great stuff. We opened it up. We made this thing 50-50 or whatever, and Jalen wound up winning this. But it's an interesting discussion because I do agree with you. Culture, it runs the edge of a knife, right? Like, it's one of those things where it's very easy to fall off, and you don't want to make the kind of decisions where guys can look at it later and be like, okay, like, he's telling me if I do the right things, then I'll be rewarded for it down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And then have him say, but what happened to this guy?
Yeah. I also don't think we should do revisionist history with Jalen. He was bad against Iowa State, and it was bad in the first half against TCU. So you're looking at the two Big 12 defenses really outside of West Virginia, and he struggled. You know, here are his stats for the final 6 quarters before he got hurt. 50% completion, right? 182 yards total on 24 attempts, with 15 yards rushing on 15 attempts.
Yeah.
I mean, like, just for me, like, it's not like Jalen Daniels was tearing the world up, right? If the injury happened against Houston and that's the level he was playing at, sure, totally. I understand it, right?
Yep.
I just think for me, if you're going to look at the data points of what's happened most recently, Jalen Daniels was not great right before he got hurt. And Jason Bean wasn't great to start, but he's been better now. And I think your point about doing a midweek competition works because guess what? Both guys know the offense. It's not like the offensive line needs time to figure it out. The wide receivers sure don't need time to figure it out. Like, they've been around both these guys for so long. So I think overall, it's just a fascinating decision on my point. But any more thoughts from you before we get out of here?
No, I don't think so. I think we hit a lot of this stuff. You know, it's so funny because I think we've talked again about complementary football and about the fact that even when Kansas is running for 2 or 3 yards of carry on first down or second down, and people are getting mad and throwing stuff around their room because they're like, just throw the ball. You wanted to be able to sort of bleed the clock and make sure your defense was in a good spot. And people don't necessarily look at it that way. Against Oklahoma State, Kansas just didn't even make that a discussion because they ran the ball so well, averaged so many yards per play. What were they at? Almost 9, I think. Over 8, I'm pretty sure.
It was good.
But, you know, 8.0 yards per play. When you look at that, that was what it looks like when Kansas wins a football game, when Kansas runs the ball effectively, when Kansas converts big third downs, when Kansas's defense is opportunistic and also doesn't allow explosive plays. If you were to say to me, hey, is there a version of this Kansas team that can win one of these last few games? I think you saw it on Saturday.
Yep. I agree. I think you saw the recipe for success. Well, thank you as always for listening to the Fog.net podcast. If you're listening on any sort of podcast platform, please leave us a rating and review, and then head over to our YouTube channel, The Fog, Kansas Basketball and Football Coverage. Subscribe, like. We've got plenty of YouTube content. We've got a video of fans tearing down the goalpost and putting it in Potter Lake. Caroline Soar, our video intern, took a video of that and followed the fans and got all that stuff. We've got other videos we have up there. And if you're watching on YouTube, head over to your podcast platform of choice and look up The Fog, a Kansas Athletics podcast as well. Thank you all, as always, for listening. We'll have a midweek podcast coming your way, probably some basketball stuff maybe after the game on Monday too. So busy times ahead, busy times. Thanks always for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.